Hello, it's Mr. Jewell from Pace again with a story about judging others. This is the 15th video I've made since the start of this school year back in September. Some of you may have watched every one, others may only have seen some of them. I wonder if you think I'm stood in a really posh film studio right now, with lots of special effects and brilliant technology. Well, that would be amazing, but it's not quite how it is. If my friend Dave shows us what else there is to see, you may be surprised. There's a tree, some shelves, some tools, planks and sawdust. And then this way, there's a table, a chair and a wood-burning stove. That's how we kept warm, filming in winter. Does that surprise you? Did you think we were in a studio at the BBC when all the time we actually have been at DGS, Dave's Garden Shed? Things aren't always what they seem, are they? Sometimes we can jump to conclusions that are mistaken or maybe even very wrong. There's a well-known saying that fits well with this thought. Have you ever heard someone say, you can't judge a book by its cover? That means that we shouldn't judge how good or bad something is simply by looking at the outside. We need to find out what's beneath the surface. There are some amazing examples of this in the world around us. A rather dull-looking caterpillar or chrysalis can be transformed into the most amazingly beautiful butterfly. On the outside it looked boring, brown and very ordinary, but sooner or later out bursts something of beauty with brilliantly bright colours. A fisherman might find something that looks like a rough, flat, grey rock at the bottom of the seabed. But when it is opened, he can't quite believe his eyes when he discovers the oyster contains the most wonderful pearl that not only looks fantastic, but is fabulously valuable too. You may have heard the story of the ugly duckling, when a very scruffy-looking baby bird one day changes into the most gorgeous and graceful swan. Perhaps at Christmas or birthdays, you get very excited to see a pile of colourfully wrapped presents with your name on. Maybe when you were younger, your eyes were always drawn first to the biggest present. Surely that must be the best one. But as the years have gone by, you've realised that sometimes the smallest present can contain the biggest surprise of all. I once heard a true story about some people who went on an aeroplane flight in Holland. Most of them travelled by plane quite regularly and were used to seeing the cabin crew walking up and down the aisle. But only occasionally would they catch a brief glimpse of the pilot. As long as the pilot did a good job and flew the plane safely from A to B, they didn't really give him a second thought. Until one day, one of the passengers saw his face and thought he looked strangely familiar. They were all amazed to discover that the pilot, in his uniform and pilot's cap, just like all the other pilots at the airport, was actually their king. He worked for the airline every so often because he was a qualified pilot and he loved to fly. The passengers thought he was just like every other pilot until they took a closer look. In the Bible, when Samuel was given the task of finding the first king of Israel, he was told by God to choose little David, even though he was the youngest in his family. God said, man looks on the outside, but God looks on the heart. God cares about us on the inside. Some people think the Bible is a boring book. Sometimes it can look pretty unexciting from the outside, but be careful not to judge a book by its cover. I hope the stories I tell you have helped you to realise that behind the covers and beneath the surface there is something very special. It contains some simply super stories, extraordinary events, compelling characters, wonderfully good news and some amazing wisdom, which means that it teaches us some really important life lessons that can help us live the best way possible. Many of these life lessons were taught by Jesus. He had an amazing way of knowing just what made people tick, how they thought, and how to handle the sort of actions and attitudes they showed and sometimes struggled with. Once Jesus had something to say to people who are always quick to judge others. to point out the wrong in others and make them feel bad for living a certain way. Maybe he had been standing in a shed like this, or perhaps he had been thinking about his childhood when he would have stood for many hours alongside his father Joseph in a carpenter's workshop, because Jesus used sawdust and planks to make his point, saying, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." What he meant was this. Sometimes we can be quick to notice and complain about something small someone else has done, a speck of sawdust. But we fail to notice or remember or realise that we do things wrong too. And sometimes our mistakes are as big as a plank of wood. This verse encourages us to stop being critical of others and trying to sort them out for the better when we've got plenty of sorting out ourselves to do. When we point a finger at someone, have you ever noticed there are 3 fingers pointing back at us? So is there 1, 2 or 3 things that we could start work on changing for the better this week? Are we sometimes grumpy? Are we sometimes selfish? Are we sometimes untidy? Why don't we see if we can change 1 thing for the better over the next few days? I'm going to finish with a prayer. Please join with me, or just sit quietly if you'd prefer. Dear God, help us not to be too quick to judge other people. Help us to listen to others and see the best in them. Help us too to work at those things we need to change for the better. Amen.